Welcome back to the show. You're listening to us on SiriusXM Radio. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics. My guest now is John Hood, president of the John William Pope Foundation, North Carolina grant-making organization, and one of the founders of the Freedom Conservatism. And freedom, conservatism, two words that are important right now. John wrote a piece for us last week. I urge you to go to our website and read it. And the headline is, poses the question and John answers it. Is the big, beautiful bill really a big, beautiful bill? Or is it something less than that? Democrats call it a big, big, ugly mess. John, tell our listeners, and if you're listening to us on SiriusXM, or if you're watching us on our podcast, where do you come down? This is the big question.
It is a big question. There's no question that the bill itself is quite large. It goes in a lot of different directions. It has a lot of things that I like, that freedom conservatives like. By extending the tax cuts from 2017, it avoids a significant weight on the economy, makes some other tax changes permanent, like expensing the investments that companies make, making sure that inflation doesn't eat into the value of the deduction that companies get from that is going to be very good for corporate investment. So there's a lot of different things that are going well in this bill fiscally. It also has some policy that conservatives like. It has a new school choice program. It expands health savings accounts, does a variety of things that conservatives have every reason to applaud, including limiting student loan subsidies for graduate students, which is a good idea. That's where most of the debt that has been accumulated at the federal level for student loans for graduate programs. It's not for undergraduate needy kids or anything. So all good. Unfortunately, it also dramatically increases the deficits over the next several years. It adds trillions more to the national debt than would otherwise have occurred. And I think we can all agree that might be bad. So concluding that there are ways to look at this bill and be happy, or ways to look at this bill and be mournful, I think is the best way. It's certainly the way I saw it. Like a lot of legislation, you take the good and the bad and you try to double down on the good and work hard to eliminate the bad later.
John, you talk about the deficit, and Elon Musk, who was sort of a late convert in life to being a fiscal hawk, he's made this point. He's threatening to start a third party over it. But you go back, look, the modern conservative movement. You date it to Bill Buckley or Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan, but I remember Reagan ran in 1980, and he said he was going to cut taxes, increase defense spending, and balance the budget. Well, he did the first two. It turns out the three weren't compatible. And, we can all say that, there's something to supply side economics. Art Laffer, he's still around. We had him on the show. But there's also something to math. And I look at these cuts. Now, I'm not a conservative. I'm not a liberal. I'm not an independent kind of centrist guy. I look at what the Democrats were saying. These terrible cuts to Medicaid, these awful draconian cuts. And I look at the conservatives saying, well, we got these tax cuts. And if the deficit was your only issue, you'd say, all right, we need all those cuts, plus we need to let the tax cuts sunset, and we're still going to be in debt. What's your answer? Right. So what's your answer to that, speaking as a conservative? Because to me, part of being conservative, maybe it's my age, is fiscal responsibility. But I don't see that in this bill.
You don't see it in either party, and you don't see it sufficiently in this bill. And you're right. I mean, all of those things are true. Back in the early 80s, when the Reagan administration came in, they really did plan to balance the budget, or at least reduce the deficits quite a lot, in part because their tax cuts were not as big as they ended up being. When they originally designed those tax cuts in 1981, they were assuming inflation would remain high, that would keep kicking taxpayers into higher tax brackets. And so they actually underestimated how big their tax cut was, because inflation came crashing down. And that's what caused the deficits. It wasn't that the Reagan administration didn't care about spending restraint. They had some, but simply not enough. Similarly, right now, what we're looking at is members of Congress who know that Rand Paul's complaints about the deficit busting effects of this bill are true. They haven't given up necessarily. Some of them have, but most of them haven't given up on the notion that we should be fiscally responsible. They just hope there'll be subsequent opportunities to be fiscally responsible. I think this was the moment to do it. I think it was a missed opportunity. But in fairness to the Democrats and Republicans, neither of which have been serious about this, their belief is that the American public doesn't care about this, that the American public simply wants candy and sweets and snacks, and no one ever wants to cut. And there is something to that. But unless politicians start standing up and saying, we are not going to lie to you, we're going to tell you the truth, math is math. At this point, you can't cut taxes further and expect to get more revenue. That's not going to happen for the most part, and most tax cuts do not pay for themselves. That's not why we do them. We do them for other reasons. We don't do them in order to maximize revenue to the government. And so if we're going to do that, we have to take on entitlements, Medicaid certainly, more so even than this bill does, and also Social Security and Medicare. Yes, we're going to get rid of waste and fraud and abuse in government. There's some of that. And you have to go further if you really want to get this deficit, even not balanced, even not get the government the budget balanced, but just get it down to 2 or 3% of GDP, something we could afford.
John, when we're talking about the deficits, you and I are reliving, ancient history now. But Walter Mondale at the Democratic National Convention in 1984 famously said, got up there and said, "I will raise your taxes." And then people stunned, and he said, So the other guy, but I just said it. And the Reagan people just lit their chops and, carried 49 states. But Walter Mondale was right. And in 1986, the Reagan administration decided that they'd gone too far with some of these tax cuts. And Bob Dole was head of the Senate Finance. And they came up with a package. They didn't call it it wasn't an income tax increase, but they raised some more money. And it makes me wonder if the American people are, as you said, they're just so used to now being told they can have everything. They want the candy. What would happen if a leader came forward and said, all right, a president, probably take a president, said, we can't have any more tax cuts. We're going to have spending cuts. Then we're going to look at Social Security. We're going to have a 2-year freeze on the cost of living increases. This is going to be sacrifice, but everybody's going to do it. And both parties have to work together. The Democrats like to say they like to punish millionaires and billionaires, and we like to say our thing. But, every American's going to have to sacrifice, because if we don't, we are jeopardizing our standing in the world, and we're hurting our children and grandchildren. And this must be done. We can't be acting like children. Would that play politically?
I think it depends on how it's structured. I think you're absolutely right that it cannot be Democratic president, Democratic Congress, or Republican president, Republican Congress. I just don't think that's a saleable plan. We know when we got to budget balance briefly in the late 90s, it was in part because we had a Republican Congress that was taking it seriously for the first time. That really was the Clinton people had not planned to get to a balanced budget. The Republicans forced it, but they couldn't have done it without Bill Clinton, in my view. And so we are going to have to do that. We are going to have to look on the revenue side. I think you could probably get some Republicans there, not by raising tax rates, I suspect, but by maximizing revenue in other ways. There are public lands that need to be sold. That was in the original bill, and it should have stayed in the bill. But also there are spending subsidies or subsidies embedded in the tax code. And whether you call them a spending subsidy or a tax break or something, those are something I think you could close and not have a revolt on your hands. On the Democratic side of things, most of the members of Congress know that our current Medicare and Social Security arrangements and Medicaid arrangements are not sustainable. Just like the Republicans think, we'll do that 2 or 3 or 10 years from now. So the Democrats say, oh, yeah, we know we're going to have to change the benefit formula and all that, but we're not going to do it right now. We're not going to do it right now caucus is shrinking. It's going to inevitably shrink because we are, in fact, the trust funds are going to be exhausted. The so-called trust funds are going to be exhausted not even a decade from now. And so we're going to have to start to make some real changes. You've narrated the 1980s story. The real thing that happened was in 82 and 83. When Reagan came back in, they did a small tax increase in 1982. But in 1983, they had that big Social Security deal. And that, in fact, cut benefits and raise taxes. And
that was
1984 and got reelected.
Well, that was the Greenspan Commission. And, you make a good point, John, because why did they agree to that? Because both parties felt vulnerable. Reagan was pretty confident in reelection, but he'd lost 26 seats in the House in the 82 midterms, and both parties felt they had to act responsible. It's like a moment in time where we talk about this window. If the Democrats take back the House next year, and people think that it's likely, maybe you'll have another moment like that, because you're right, both parties can't be in control, but they can't also just be on the back foot. They both have to have something good going for them and be vulnerable to get a compromise,
I think
guess.
history would tell us, and it isn't just history at the federal level, because we haven't had very many balanced budgets at the federal level to have a history of. But if you look at states, if you look at other countries, if you take on a fiscal crisis of this magnitude, you're going to have to do it by getting people of both parties to buy in on it, because otherwise that's sort of a prisoner's dilemma and you can't get out of it. So I agree with all that. This didn't happen in 2025, and I suspect it probably wasn't going to happen. But I do think in the next few years, smart politicians will figure out a way to get to this point, and they will realize if they look at the Real Clear Politics average going back into the 90s, when was the only time that Americans had any confidence in Congress? It was when there was a balanced budget.
Well, that ought to be a lesson. All right, well, that's going to do it for us for this segment. You've been listening to John Hood, who's got a piece in Real Clear Politics. You ought to read it. It's about, whether this bill was good or bad, and John thinks it was both. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, Real Clear Politics, and we'll be back right after these messages.